Good morning, and thanks for attending our webinar, Leveraging Purchasing Modules. My name is Sue Veers, and I'm a Senior Consultant with Maynard Costerisan. I've grouped the agenda into modules, so we're going to take a look at that right now. So the first thing we're going to look at is payables, and I'm not going to read all of these, but these are all the things that we are going to look at in the payables module. Then we're going to go on to purchasing, and then into the Professional Services Tools Library, or commonly known as the Pistol Tools. And there are quite a few features in the Pistol Tools for the purchasing module. We're going to go on to financial, and then lastly with the SmartList. So we're going to go right into GP. Okay, the first thing that we're going to look at is the vendor card. So there are quite a few ways of looking up vendors, and sometimes it gets frustrating because we don't always see the vendors the way we want to. So we can use any one of the columns. Up here in the upper left-hand corner, Find By is usually the default find. When I click on vendor name, it changes to vendor name, but when I close the screen and open it back up, it still is Find By Vendor ID. So how do I change that to vendor name? Because I'm always sorting by vendor name. So all I have to do is click on vendor name, go into this view options, the little black drop-down arrow, and set as default. Now when I close the window and open it back up, I see that it now is defined by vendor name. I also have additional sorts over here, and these are predefined sorts that I can always have at my disposal, and I can make any one of those my default view as well. I can click on custom sort, and let's say that I want to sort by state. So I want all of my vendors in state order. Once I click on that, I see that all of my vendors are now in state order. When I click on the down arrow, I don't see by state because it is part of the custom sort. How do I get that to be a predefined sort? That is where the advanced lookups comes into play. So I'm going to close this window, and I'm going to go into the administration tab. Now you may have to have your GP administrator do this for you if you don't have access to the system setup, and this is in the company setup screen. I've got various different sorts that I can do throughout the system, but I'm going to pick vendor. And I will come here and I'll pick state. So I can have up to 4 predefined sorts. So we're just going to pick state and save that. Now when we go back to purchasing, and we go back to vendor, now when I click on my down arrow, I have by state. So that's my predefined sort. So again, I can have up to 4 of these. And I can make that my default sort if I need to. Other things I can do with my sort is I can exclude inactive vendors. I can have my SmartList favorites, and I can pull my 1099s because that's a favorite within my SmartList. If I have made favorites from my SmartList designer, I can use that as well. So there are just many, many different ways that you can use the sort option within GP. We're going to look at our first vendor here, and we're going to go to account. So the next thing we're going to look at is just this purchases line. This purchases line is where you would put in the most commonly used account for that particular vendor. So in the ACE Travel, their default is travel service installation. And by clicking on the ellipse button, I can create additional accounts in this window. I can default on transaction, meaning that when I go into my distribution, I can have those accounts available to me so that I can distribute the money between those accounts. If I don't default on transaction, then I'm going to get a lookup when I go to my looking glass, And I can actually create like a mini chart of accounts for my vendor. One other thing that you can do is, how this works is, if I have a $500 voucher and I go into distribution, the $500 will be distributed to the account that's on the vendor account maintenance screen. So this $465.20, $500 will be sitting against this account. Now, certainly I can change that amount and then I can distribute it however I need to. If you have vendors that you don't have a main account and you don't want the money to default to a certain account, you can remove the account from this screen and add it over here. So I could add the $465.20 over here, default on transaction. Now when I put in that voucher for $500 and I go into distribution, no money is distributed and I can distribute as I need. So that's just some ways of using this account distribution for the vendor. Next thing we're going to look at is the all-in-one view. So once I click on the all-in-one view, I'm going to be able to see the life cycle of a purchase order, invoice, whichever you choose. So I can go to options. If I'm not using the purchase order module, I can take off these columns, and there are a couple other columns that I can add. Once I define what columns I want to see, each column has its own filters. So I can look at open historical purchase orders. When I get into the invoices, I can look at saved, open, and history. And then I also have some filters. So I can look at PO number contains a certain amount. I can click on options, and I have 3 different search criteria so that way I can quickly get down to the information that I need. Once I define any kind of filters that I want, we can scroll through these purchase orders. So I can click on the next 5, so forth. We're going to look at PO 2034. When I click on the little box in the upper right-hand corner, this will show me the life cycle of that purchase order. So I see it had 1 receipt, 1 invoice, and 1 payment. I can drill down into this purchase order. It takes me into the PO inquiry screen so that I can look at that PO. I can also click on the down arrow and I can see more information about that purchase order. And then just by taking off the checkbox, I go back to the original settings. I also, on each column, have the ascending and descending so that I can sort by that as well. And the all-in-one view is available in multiple windows throughout the purchase order module and payables. Now, if you're using both payables and purchase order, sometimes when you enter an invoice, do I go into enter match invoice or do I go into transaction entry to put that in? If you're new to the system, sometimes it's a little confusing which screen I need to go into. So in the payable setup, there is an option to warn if vendor has existing purchase order. And this came into GP 2016. So this will prevent me from double paying an invoice. So once you turn that on and we go into transaction entry, and we'll put in an invoice here for Ace Travel. We put a $50 invoice on. Once I save, I'm going to get a warning, and it's telling me that the vendor has existing purchase orders. So I can do one of two things. I can continue. Maybe this $50 has nothing to do with purchase order, and I know that. So yes, I'm in the right window, and I'm going to continue putting in this $50. If I cancel, it's just going to cancel and go back to the screen. And I can then use the go-to. If I choose to use the go-to, it's going to cancel that voucher entry that I have in there, and it's going to bring up the list of all of the open purchase orders and purchase purchasing transactions for that particular vendor. So that way, that will give me a warning to prevent against duplicate payments. By clicking on the purchasing up in the upper left-hand corner there, we'll go back to our purchasing desktop. Now I'm using 2018, and with 2018, they have updated the date. So now I'm on 4/12 of 2027. So you will see some advanced dates throughout this demo. And one thing that they've done is they've renamed the word check to payment. So that way there's no confusion, because now there are multiple ways to pay someone. We can pay by check, we can pay by EFT, or we can pay by credit card. So as you look at the screen, you will see that where check, the name check used to be, is now replaced by the word payment. So we're going to look at the build payment batch. One of the new features, and I've created some batches already, so I'm just going to pick my first one here. One of the new features in GP 2018 is the payment option ID. This allows you to save your selected criteria within this build payment batch window so that you can reuse that criteria from payment to payment run without needing to re-enter the information. There are a couple of things to watch out for. One, the dates are saved with absolute value. So if you use a cutoff date, it will save that particular date. So you'll have to remove and re-enter. The other one is if you have multiple companies, you would have to set them up for each company so it doesn't move from company to company. So we're going to take a look at this. So I have a couple options here. The one we're going to look at right now is the priority. So I've set up a priority of 3. So I've set up vendors that have a priority of 3 because I need to quickly pay them. So all I'm going to do is build batch, and any priority 3 vendor will come forward for me. So now I can use this option priority again and again. Another thing new for GP 2018 is this one payment per. They've added use vendor option. Prior to GP 2018, you only had the vendor in the invoice, meaning this whole batch, if you chose vendor, all the vouchers that are for that particular vendor will be grouped into one payment. If you chose invoice, every single voucher within that batch would be its own separate payment. So now they allow you to choose per vendor if that vendor will be grouped together as one payment, or each individual voucher will be its own payment. And that's going to be in the vendor setup. So we're going to go take a look at this. We're going to go into options, and this is the new line, vendor invoice. So that's a new line within GP 2018. Where this becomes valuable is, let's say Ace Travel here, we're going to keep them on vendor because all the vouchers are going to be grouped into one payment. But let's say you have a bank and you have multiple loans and you want each loan to be its own payment. That bank could then be invoice. And so that way each invoice will be its own payment. And we can now pay them all together within one batch where we couldn't do that before. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is edit payment batch. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this screen. This screen allows you to quickly either add or take away vendors from the batch. I can click on any one. I can mark or unmark any one of the vouchers here to be paid. The top gives me check information or batch information, and then the right-hand side gives me some checkbook information about the balances before and after. But what I can do is I can go to columns and I can add multiple columns into this area. So I'm going to add the document number. What this allows me to do then is to add this document number, and if I have a edit list, I can make sure I'm getting the exact vouchers paid that I need to. And that will remain there until I take off the column. So you can add and remove columns as you need them. Another thing that's been added into GP, and we'll take a look at another batch here, is the credit card. This came in with GP 2016. If you enter vouchers individually and then pay by credit card at a later date, you can move the vouchers from the purchasing vendor or vendors to the credit card vendor in one step. So let's say, for instance, you want to monitor what you buy from Home Depot or Lowe's or OfficeMax. You can put those vouchers in under those particular vendors and then move them to the credit card vendor all in one step. Prior to that, you had to do it one at a time through manual payments. So no entry will be made to the general ledger. All you're doing is moving that liability from the original vendor to the credit card vendor. If you've ever needed to print a prepayment or make a prepayment and you don't have a voucher for it and you want to cut a check or do an EFT transaction without having a voucher, if you go into Edit Vendor Payments, and we're going to select our batch. Once you select your vendor, here in the unapplied amount, you can type in an amount that you need to prepay. Maybe somebody needs to take a check quickly. You don't have the voucher for that, and you don't want to just put in a fake voucher for it. By cutting the check or the EFT payment now, then at a later date when you put the voucher in, you can apply that voucher to this payment. So that's how you would do a prepayment in the Payables module. One area that I think is underutilized within GP is this navigation section over here in the upper right-hand corner, and every module has that. We're going to look at our vendors, and it's just going to quickly give me a list of all of my vendors. Now at the top, I have an action pane. That's going to allow me to run reports. Maybe I want to add a new vendor or add a new invoice or voucher within the system. I can do that with whatever vendor that I have marked. On the bottom is the info or information pane, where as I scroll through my vendors here, you can see it changing to where I can see my current balance, my last check amount, so I can get information for these vendors. I can also add filters. Unlike the SmartList, where I'm only allowed 4 search criteria, I can add as many filters as I need. I have a lot of different fields and a lot of different operators that I can search for my vendors. So I'm just going to leave it as vendor name contains, and I'm going to type in COMP and click on the arrow. Now, every vendor that contains COMP, whether it be company or computer, will come forward for me. Another neat thing that I can do here is that I can run reports for vendors that are out of sequence. So if you need to run like an aging for vendors that are out of sequence, get them on one report, this is the area you would do that. So I've checked 3 vendors here. I'm going to go to reports. I can print a list that I have checked. I can print an aging or an historical aging. So I'm just going to print an aging. Once I print the aging, I can include the details, the date that I want to age as of, and print. Once this comes up to the screen, you'll see that I've got one report with 3 vendors on there. Now, if I've taken the time and I've created these navigation searches, I can save them just like I can a favorite on a SmartList. So I'm going to go down vendor, save as, and whatever I name this here will become available to me under the vendor section so that I can use that the next time. By clicking purchasing, I'm back to my purchasing desktop. we're going to take a look at checklists. Checklists can help you identify frequency procedures. So for instance, I can do month end, quarter end, year end. We do that once a year, and we tend to forget year after year what exactly are the reports that we need to run. What do we need to do that year end? Or maybe I'm going to be on vacation during month end and I need to tell somebody these are all the routines that you need to do for the month end. We can add notes so that I can either remind myself or remind somebody else what they need to do. And I can add routines. So I can click on add. One thing that I do with using checklists is that I will always make my user date the end of the month or the month that I'm closing. So I'm going to create one, change date to end of month, because all of my reports are already set up to use the beginning of the month, end of month. Now I can add a GP window, an external task, or a macro. So I can bring in an Excel spreadsheet. I can bring in a Word doc if I need to. I can create a GP macro and run that as well. For this date, it's just going to be a GP window. Once I click on the lookup, I'm going to get my selection screen. Now, if I were to choose an external task, I would get my browse button so I could browse out to those Excel or Word documents that I need. Now, I know that the user date is under company and they're all alphabetical, so it's easy to find. And I'm going to click on user date, OK, and then OK again. Now it will drop it down to the bottom, but we have these directional buttons, so that I'm going to move that to the top because that's the very first thing I want myself or the person to do. Once I double click, it's going to bring up my user date. I can change it to the end of the month. Once I say OK, it's going to user date and time stamp it. Now, one caution though, because I clicked into that and I did not change the date, it will still stamp the information on this window and it tells me that somebody opened it. But we're assuming that if they're running the report and they double click on it, they are going to run that report. So now we're going to go into purchase order entry. One thing that we can all use, and I use it myself, is the help buttons. So if I'm on a screen and I don't know exactly what to enter, or I might be new to the system and I don't know exactly what GP wants me to put into these fields, or I look at a new module and I just kind of want to find out a little bit more about it. Any window in GP, if you go to help, about this window, it's context sensitive help. It knows I'm on the purchase order entry screen. And it's going to give me information about that window. And then I can click on fields. And then in the fields, I can actually see every single field within that window and what it wants. So it's very, very useful information. So we're going to enter a purchase order here. And we're going to pick Advanced Office Systems. And this is a vendor that I purchase the same thing from, or mostly the same things from, all the time. So one thing that I can do is under Actions, I can copy PO lines. Now when I click on the looking glass, I'm going to get all of my open purchase orders for this particular vendor. I can click on my view options and I can look at historical purchase orders if I need to do that. But we're going to stay with the open ones, and I'm just going to click on this first one here. Now I can click on the preview screen, and I can see the line or lines that are on that particular purchase order. I can change quantities, change cost if I need to, or I can wait till it gets onto the purchase order to change those. So I'm going to click OK and copy. And just that quickly, I can copy from another PO. I can go and do this again. So I might want to add something from another purchase order that I know I need from this particular vendor. When I go to preview, I've got two lines on this one. I can take off any one of these check marks if I don't want that item to come into that particular purchase order, but I'm going to bring both of those in. I'm going to click OK. Now, once you have multiple lines, you're going to want to take off this little box, copy ship to address, because the ship to address may be different from line to line. And if it is, it's not going to allow you to copy that. So I'm going to copy, and now very quickly, I've added 3 lines onto this purchase order. Now, if you have a need to purchase, if you have items that you purchase from multiple vendors and you want to copy one of those over to a purchase order, we're going to start with a blank purchase order, go to Actions, Create and Copy New PO. This allows me to take items from one vendor to another vendor as long as all the items are assigned to those vendors in the item vendor maintenance screen. If they are not assigned to those items, then I cannot copy them over. So I'm going to copy from Circuit Distributing, and I'm going to pick Allinson Properties. So I click on Preview. I see that I've got 2 items here. Again, I can make any changes to the quantities, cost. I can take off any one of these items if I don't want to copy it over. Once I'm happy with everything, I take off the Copy Ship To, copy, and now I've copied a purchase order from one vendor to another vendor. Next, we're going to look at PO prepayments. We looked at payments directly through the Payables module, and this is purchase order has a prepayment. So if you have to prepay on a purchase order, and I have one set up here for sake of time, this feature was introduced in GP 2013. And with GP 2013 all the way up to GP 2016, you could only prepay the subtotal amount. With GP 2016, you can now prepay the total. So it's bringing in the freight, miscellaneous, or tax charges if you have them. Notice I have a not equal sign here. That's just a visual cue that tells me that this payment isn't posted over to the Payables module yet. So I haven't created a batch to actually cut that check or do an EFT payment. Once I define how much I want to pay or prepay, I click on the blue arrow and I get my payment option screen here. I can use a computer check, meaning check or EFT, or I can do a manual payment, and I can pick either check or credit card. So for our purposes, we're going to keep it at computer check. Now, how do I get that over to the Payables screen? So once I go into my batches, and we'll pick a batch here, I can choose either check or EFT, but this area right here, this little checkbox, is going to bring all pending prepayments into this batch. That will take away that not equal sign, and I can then go ahead and pay these prepayments. The next thing we're going to look at is tolerance handling within the purchase order receiving. This is done in the inventory module in the item purchasing options. I've created one nuts and bolts, and I've put a 5% shortage and a 5% overage for a tolerance percent. So that way, if I'm within that tolerance, it will actually automatically close the purchase order and close the line. And if it's the last thing on the purchase order, it'll close the purchase order. And then it also eliminates the need to correct receiving quantities on overages. So we're going to take a look at that. Basically, that's all you have to do. There's no other setup than to pick an item and put what percentages that you want for the tolerance. And then we're going to go back to purchasing. Now, when you do your receiving, it will look at those items. It will make sure that those items are within the tolerance percent, and then it will either close or keep open those lines. So we're going to look at edit purchase orders, and I'm going to put in a purchase order that I've created. And I purchased 100 and I received 96. So what it automatically did is I was within tolerance of that 5%. So it automatically canceled the 4. It closed this line and it closed the purchase order. So that's how easy it is to actually have those purchase orders automatically close, and it just saves a lot of manual time to do that. The next thing we're going to look at is the professional tools library. So we're going to bring up the screen here, and I'm going to go back to my purchasing window here so that we can see them both. Now, one thing that probably all of you are familiar with is the vendor combiner and modifier, which is over here in the utilities. The vendor modifier gives you the ability to take an existing vendor and then create a new vendor, so that if a vendor changes names, you can quickly change that. And you do not lose any of your data. Vendor combiner allows you to take 2 existing vendors, so they have to be vendors within the system, and it combines that data without losing any data from either one of those vendors. Now, this has been flushed out basically on the utilities, so again, it's just easier to get at, and you don't have to go to the professional tools library. Now we're going to look at the professional tools library, and the first thing we're going to look at is the 1099 modifier. Some of these tools you do directly within the pistol tools. Other ones you just turn on and then you use them elsewhere. As you notice over here in the utilities, we have an update 1099 information. And in the pistol tools, we have the 1099 modifier. What's the difference, and when would I use one over the other? Both tools will allow you to update the 1099 amounts for a vendor that you originally did not set up as a 1099, and then later on you found out that after you paid them a couple months, oh, they were supposed to be 1099. They will actually update the 1099 amount. With the update 1099 information, I can actually have the system take the vendor and automatically just change it from a non-1099 to miscellaneous box 7. Or I can go into the vendor card and just change it myself. The one reason why I like the 1099 modifier, the pistol tool, over this update 1099 information is if I were to go to update the 1099 transactions or vendor and transactions, once I hit process, I have no preview. It's just going to process anyone that has been changed. It will update those 1099 amounts. Within my 1099 modifier, once I click next, I can run a report first. And this is by year. So I'm just going to pick a year that I know I have some changes that need to be made, and I'm going to hit process. Once I continue and I go to the screen, I'm going to see that I have a vendor that I originally did not have set up as 1099. I made a change, and it's telling me I need to update this. So you will see every single vendor, every single voucher that is going to change. You can take a look at it, make sure it's okay, and then once everything looks okay, then you can click on the radio button, process and print report, and it will actually process and update those windows. Now, these tools only work for history tables because the work and open, it doesn't know when you're going to pay it, so it doesn't know what year you eventually will put that to. So the recommendation is run one of these tools before you run your 1099s, because the pistol tool is run by years. You can pick 2018 and then before you run them in 2019, you can pick 2018, and it will update any vendor information that needs to. The next tool is the PM minimum check. Now this one is just turned on in the pistol tool, and just to turn it on and off, anyone that has a little checkbox next to it, we're just turning it on, and I'm going to show you in just a couple of minutes how that comes into play. But this actually allows you to set a minimum amount. So if you set the minimum amount for $1, anything that's under $1, you're not going to get a check for. In the select check combiner, again, this is turned on in the pistol tools. This will allow you to consolidate into one payment when you add to batch. So if you've created your batch and then you need to add to batch, without the tool, a vendor will have two separate payments. With this tool turned on, that add to batch will actually merge all those vendors that are alike, and then you will get just one payment type for them. The minimum PO receipt number, you can, if you're using purchase order and you're on a certain purchase order, and the next time you open up the window, the PO number is lower than the last one you used. There is a blog out there about why this is being done. There's some kind of algorithm that's being used. This tool was created to prevent that. So once you turn on this tool and you set the number, it can't go below that number. The top cost defaulter, that is turned on and used within this pistol tool. So I'm going to go to next, and all you're going to choose is whether you want to default the cost on the PO from the current cost or the standard cost. So that's very easy to set up. Then in the miscellaneous tools, we're going to look at doc date verify. You may have seen this before. I think everyone should have this turned on. This will prevent you from entering dates outside of your fiscal period setup. So if you fat finger a date and it goes way out in the future, it is not going to let you enter that date. So we're going to take a look at these tools now. So we're going to go into our build payment batch. So the first one we're going to look at is minimum payment. So notice up at the top in my header, my minimum check amount, I put it at 75 just so that I could show you how this works. To set that, you just go to additional, set minimum, and you can set it for any amount that you need to if you want to use this tool. We're going to look at vendor credit, and we're going to look at Business Magazine. Notice we owe him $50. So when I come in here and I select a batch, I have an ID set up for Business Magazine, so I'm only picking him. Now watch this 0 here. What's going to happen is it's going to start pulling that $50, and we're going to see that $50 just flash in 1 second. It's going to realize it's not within my $75 range, and I'm going to get a 0 batch. So once I build the batch, it takes just a second, but you'll see it flip, and it saw the 50, but it's not going to bring it in. So that's the PM minimum check. So now the next one, the select check combiner, we're going to go back into our build check payment. I'm going to select another batch here, and I'm going to pick another ID. So I do like these IDs so that I have things set up here. So notice I've got capital printed circuits, and I've got a due date cutoff of January of 2024. So when I build the batch, we're going to see that it's going to bring over $16,000. Then I realized, ooh, I should have put that out just a little bit further, because maybe I'm going to be on vacation and I need to print checks out a little bit. So I'm going to pick that combiner again. Remember, the dates are absolute, so I need to remove that. I'm going to go back to my cutoff, and now I'm going to put this to 2/28 2024. And I'm going to insert that. Now I'm going to add the batch. Because I have that combiner turn on, I'm only going to get one check for this vendor instead of two. So I'm going to add the batch. It's going to tell me that it's going to add this. I'm going to say go ahead and continue. Now I have a choice. Do I want to save my option in my ID, or do I want to discard it and go back to January? So again, that is something that you can choose to do. I'm just going to discard. It'll go back to January the next time I pull it up. And now I see I have 46,000. To look at that, I'm going to go into the edit vendor payment, and I'm going to look at that payment, and you'll see, yes, I only have one payment for 46,000. So that's that select check binder. The next tool that we turned on was I'm down in the setup, the purchase order processing. If I click on additional minimum purchase order, this is where we would set the minimum purchase order. The one thing to watch out for, though, is the format has to be the same. So my next PO number is PO with 4 digits. I need to have this to be PO with 4 digits. Same with the receipt. I click on the box to never default to a previous number and save, and I'm all set. I'll never see another number change backwards. They will only go forward. So again, a lot of these pistol tools are just easy to set up, and they are worth their weight in gold. The last one we did was the doc date verified. We turned that on. I want to enter a payables transaction. I come in here and I accidentally put in 2035 instead of 2025. Once I tab off, it says a fiscal period for this date has not been set up. It will not allow me to enter a date outside of what I've defined as all of my fiscal periods, all of those years. When you go in to set up company fiscal periods, I can't go beyond those dates. So again, it won't let me move forward till I change the date within. Again, I recommend putting this on, turning this on, and it works with all modules. Now we're going to go into financial. You may want to monitor some expense accounts, but they're not in a range, so you can't run a trial balance, and it's hard to define. So this account roll-up inquiry, which again, I think this is another underutilized feature within GP, I can modify and select and create options. So I have one here for expenses. I'm going to monitor these 3 expense counts that are not in sequence. I chose to bring in the current and the prior year because I want to see current and prior year next to each other. So once I go into inquiry and I redisplay, I'm going to see in column 1, my current year, column 2, my previous year, and I'm going to see each period, and then I'm going to see the grand total at the end. Once I click on any one of the periods, go to column 1, I'm going to see each one of those accounts that I chose and their balances. If I click on any one of those and click on balance, I can drill down into my detail inquiry, see every transaction that makes up those balances. I can move from period to period within the screen. I can choose to display by net change or period balance. If I click into column 2, I'm going to see the prior year, and again, I can move from period to period, do exactly the same thing. Another thing that you can do with the account roll-up is narrow it down even further. So I want to just look at division 600, and I want to look at these accounts within that division, and that's what I'm going to monitor. Not only do I want current and previous year, but I also want to bring in the budget. So once I inquire and redisplay, you'll see I now have 3 columns. If I click on that 3rd column, I am looking at budget information. So that's just how quickly you can monitor accounts that are not in sequence and look at those balances. In routines, reconcile to GL. I've already created one because sometimes it does take a couple of minutes to process. We're going to look at March of 2027, or yes, 2027, and I would put in my account or accounts that are my payables, and then I define where my output file will be. Now, if this is new, I would hit process. Again, it takes a couple minutes to process that. So I'm just going to bring up the Excel spreadsheet that I've already processed. This Excel spreadsheet is in 3 different sections. The first section is the unmatched transaction. It's going to look at the subledger and then follow it through to the GL. And it's going to do it by transaction source number. So it's telling me that I've got some payables transactions, but they're not in the GL. Maybe I forgot to post a batch. So I need to go and post the batch. The next section, potentially matched, is where the system looks and says, I think I matched these, but you need to verify. The bottom section, the matched transactions, the system is saying, I definitely matched these. And then at the bottom, I have this little schedule that tells me beginning and ending balances and all of my differences. So again, if you would run this on a weekly basis, especially on a monthly basis, then you can tie out the payables to the general ledger. And then the last thing that we have in financial is in checkbook. And I just wanted to show you a couple things that pertain to the purchasing module. So once you bring up your checkbook, this is where our next check number will be found. And then in the bottom right, we've got payables options. One option that I really like is the duplicate check numbers. If I were cutting checks and I accidentally sent them to the wrong printer, or I forgot to put checks in, I can keep my check processing window open. I can open up my checkbook maintenance. I can click on allow duplicate checks, save this, go back into my check processing screen, tell it that I want to reprint. It will allow me to put in the next check number, and then I can use that same check number. Now, what it will do is it will void the first set that it thought it ran, and then it will run the check batch with those same numbers. I do not recommend keeping this on, so when you're done, you can come in and turn that back off because you don't want to have duplicate checks unless you know how they became duplicate. And then lastly, we're going to look at the SmartList. So I'm going to open up the SmartList, and we're going to start with financial. And I have one already predefined here. I have a search that says account number contains 6530 because I want all the divisions within 6530. Now I want to add subledger information. So I'm going to go to columns. I'm going to go to add. I'm going to go down to the O's. And anything that's originating is from the subsidiary module, whether it be payables, receivables, inventory. So I'm going to click on document number. I'm going to hold my control key down, and I'm going to pick master ID, master name, OK. And I'll click OK again. And just that quickly, I can see all of the information that came over to the general ledger, but I can see the subsidiary modules information. So in this case, I'm seeing my vendors. And I can double click on one, and I can go to the source document, and it's going to drill me down into the payables. Now, we're going to close the financial, and we're going to look at purchasing. So in the purchase line items, I can look at specific line items. So I've created one already, and I said the vendor ID begins with A and the item number contains PHON because I want to look at all the phones that I bought. So this is coming from the purchase order module. And just that quickly, I can look at all of the phones that I've purchased. If you don't have purchase order or you want to look at it through the payables transactions, and I'm just going to click the default here, and I'll sort by vendor ID. You can, again, do searches to just see payments, just see invoices. But if it came from the purchase order module, when I double click, it will take me back. This happened to be from the receiving, so I can still see purchase order information within my payables transactions SmartList. Or if it came from payables, when I double click, I can look at my payables transactions. So this is the end of our webinar. Thanks for taking the time out of your day for attending.